Okay, let's unpack this. It's quite the head-scratcher.
Hmm.
France, on one hand, seems to be signaling they might arrest Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu,
Hmm.
but then on the other hand, they're welcoming Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Shara. It just feels like a real diplomatic puzzle, doesn't it?
It certainly does. I mean, what jumps out immediately is that stark contrast. You've
Yeah.
got a major player, a UN Security Council member, taking this potentially really confrontational stance with one leader
Right.
while engaging quite openly with another leader who has, well, a deeply controversial past.
Absolutely. And that's really the core of what we want to dive into today. We're looking at some analysis of these seemingly opposite moves by France.
Trying to get under the hood a bit.
Exactly. Figure the motivations, the context, and, what this tells us about French foreign policy right now.
Yeah.
So our mission really is to make sense of this apparent inconsistency.
Precisely. We want to understand the underlying logic, if there is one, behind what looks like a very selective approach to diplomacy.
So let's start with the Netanyahu situation. The analysis points to this reported threat of arrest,
Hmm.
and that seems to stem from the ICC warrant, the one issued back in November 2024.
Right, related to allegations of war crimes during Israel's operations in Gaza.
And it's crucial to remember, isn't it, that France is part of the ICC.
Yes, exactly. As a signatory to the Rome Statute, France has a legal obligation to cooperate. That includes enforcing arrest warrants.
So if Netanyahu were to, say, land in Paris.
Technically, legally, France would be bound to at least consider detaining him, yes.
Right. But the analysis we're looking at highlights the strong reaction this has caused, especially online. Lots of criticism aimed at President Macron.
Yeah, some people are arguing, why target Israel's leader now? When the country's facing security threats from groups like Hamas, it's about the timing and the focus.
And that brings up this interplay between law and politics, doesn't it?
It really does. Is France just fulfilling its legal duty as an ICC member? Or is this kind of tangled up with their more vocal support for a Palestinian state? That's a key question here.
Good point. The analysis mentions Macron aiming for recognition of a Palestinian state by, June 2025?
Hmm.
And that stance has clearly ruffled feathers in Israel. Netanyahu, his government.
Hmm.
They've been quite critical.
Well, if you look at France's history in the region, they've advocated for a two-state solution for a long time.
Sure.
Macron himself has engaged before on, say, the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But this ICC warrant angle, it could signal something more assertive, maybe trying to, boost French influence on this issue.
And the perception of inconsistency is definitely out there. The analysis notes commentators online comparing this to how France handles its own separatist issues.
Suggesting a double standard, basically.
And how they apply principles like sovereignty or international law.
And that's a critical point, because when a country's actions seem inconsistent, well, it can really damage its credibility, right?
Absolutely. Makes it harder to be influential.
It raises that fundamental question. How do nations juggle legal duties, strategic goals, and domestic pressures?
Okay, now let's flip to the other side of the coin. Welcoming Ahmed al-Shara. This is where the contrast gets really sharp.
Very sharp. Al-Shara, formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the leader of HTS.
And just for clarity, HTS is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
That's right. An organization with established ties to al-Qaeda. It's designated as a terrorist group by the UN, the US, the EU, the UK, pretty much everyone.
Okay. But the analysis explains that after Bashar al-Assad's regime reportedly fell back in December 2024, al-Shara emerged as Syria's interim president. And this is the person France is now engaging with.
France's reasoning, or at least the reported reasoning, seems to be pragmatic. They need to support some kind of transitional government in Syria to avoid, even more chaos.
Trying to prevent a vacuum.
Exactly. And this fits with Macron's other diplomatic moves, like meeting with Turkey's Erdogan, trying to stabilize things regionally.
But this hasn't gone down smoothly at all.
No, far from it. The analysis points to significant criticism, again, especially online. People point to al-Shara's past as a jihadist alleged involvement in violence.
Right. And Macron's accused of basically choosing geopolitics over values.
And you also have reports, which are important here, about ongoing human rights abuses in Syria under al-Shara, concerns about minorities, for instance.
So that context just intensifies the whole controversy, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it fuels that perception of a double standard when you put it right next to the stance on Netanyahu.
So we have this clear split. A tough stance, possibly arrest, for Netanyahu based on an international warrant.
Legal grounds.
While at the same time engaging with al-Shara whose background and alleged current actions are deeply problematic.
Precisely. And it really just highlights that incredibly complex balancing act in foreign policy, the constant push and pull between stated principles and what are seen as practical geopolitical necessities.
So let's step back a bit. What's the bigger picture here? What might be driving these, well, seemingly contradictory French actions?
Well, the analysis suggests France is trying to carve out its own sphere of influence in the Middle East, maybe act as a counterweight to, say, the US or Russia.
And pushing for Palestinian statehood fits into that.
It aligns with their historical position, yes,
Uh-huh.
but it's definitely creating friction with Israel, especially with the current government and recent events.
The analysis also mentioned those Israeli strikes near Damascus earlier this year.
Right, which Israel justified as targeting HTS and protecting minorities, but which Syria and Turkey condemned as destabilizing. It just adds another layer of complexity.
So coming back to the ICC warrant for Netanyahu, France can argue it's just law.
They can. They can say, look, we're just fulfilling our Rome Statute obligations.
But the timing.
The timing and the stark contrast with how they're handling al-Shara inevitably raises questions. Is it selective? Are political calculations driving this as much as legal ones?
So what are the potential ripple effects, the implications of France taking this stance?
Well, first off, there's the risk of really alienating Israel. That's a key player in a very volatile region, regardless of disagreements.
And the relationship between Netanyahu and Macron is already strained, right?
It seems to be, which could
Yeah.
make it harder for France to play any kind of mediation role later on, especially if the U.S., maybe under President Trump, is pursuing its own separate track.
And what about France's image, their reputation? You mentioned human rights earlier.
Exactly. Macron has often spoken about protecting civilians, so engaging with a leader like al-Shara, who faces serious accusations, it risks undermining France's credibility on human rights.
Opens them up to charges of hypocrisy.
Absolutely. You see it already online and in the press. People point out the contrast with, say, criticism of civilian suffering in Gaza. It fuels that narrative.
It really does shine a light on how difficult it is to apply international law consistently.
Totally. For some, that ICC warrant is about crucial accountability. For others, it's politically charged, ignoring Israel's security reality.
And France's selective approach just highlights that whole messy reality.
It forces us to see how international law and diplomacy are often tangled up with national interests, strategic thinking, which can lead to these outcomes that look, well, contradictory if you just look at the principles.
So let's try to bring it all together. We've looked at this apparent contradiction in French policy. Tough on Netanyahu, potentially, links to the ICC, but pragmatic, maybe too pragmatic for some, in engaging with Syria's al-Shara.
And the core tension seems to be between France's legal commitments, like with the ICC, and its geopolitical goals, wanting stability in Syria, engaging even with difficult figures to achieve it.
It's a balancing act.
A very difficult one. And it inevitably invites criticism, accusations of double standards.
It definitely gives you food for thought. Thinking about the wider implications when international law seems to be applied selectively like this. How do a nation's values and its strategic needs end up shaping these incredibly complex, sometimes seemingly contradictory decisions on the world stage? It's quite a challenge to watch unfold.